and I'd like to welcome you tonight to our second installment of our Science and Theology discussion series, this one entitled, What is Love, Science and Faith in Conversation? Not to be confused with the hit club song in Night at the Roxbury of the same name. If you came here hoping to hear that, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Please collect your refund on the way out. But in all seriousness, this evening, we'll be discussing a concept of deep importance to all our lives, love. In spite of the personal relevance of the word, it can be difficult to define. What is this thing we call love? How is it experienced, and how do we love others? Is love a matter of free will, or is it a servant to our selfish interests? How is it love can so profoundly break down, as we've seen in the tumultuous divides of our present era? We've invited 4 experts tonight to weigh in on these and related questions. Our goal is to facilitate a conversation on love that weaves together the best insights from a diverse set of disciplines: biology, psychology, philosophy, and theology. And in so doing, come away with a better understanding of love, what it is, and how we can best love others. This discussion series could not have been possible without the generous support of the Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries, or STEAM project. The STEAM project seeks to foster a better conversation between Christian faith, science, and technology, and is hosted by the Fuller Theological Seminary and funded by the Templeton Foundation. Tonight's discussion is also sponsored by the Christian Graduate Student Alliance, the Veritas Forum, Ohio State's Center for Ethics and Human Values, and the Student Activity Feed. And if you enjoy the conversation tonight, we invite you to continue the discussion with the Christian Graduate Student Alliance every Friday night at 6 p.m. in Ale Hall. And we'll also have contact cards outside if you'd be interested in getting in touch with us. The goal of this STEAM discussion series at OSU is to dig into the big questions facing our society today with complementary perspectives from science and faith. To that end, we've asked our presenters tonight to share personally, ask honest questions of each other, and model a conversation that all of us can continue this evening and beyond. Normally, this is about the point where I'd ask you to take out your cell phone and turn it off, but we're not going to do that tonight. Tonight, I actually encourage you to text us. Specifically, we encourage you to send us your questions for our presenters throughout the evening by texting them to the number on the screen, 614-245-5451. And again, I'll be putting this up in the Q&A period, so you don't have to memorize that right now. And during the Q&A period, our moderator, Dr. Brown, will choose the most popular questions, and he'll present them to our speakers. So now I'll just go through and introduce each one of our wonderful speakers tonight. So our moderator tonight will be Dr. Stephen Brown. Dr. Brown received his PhD in philosophy from The Ohio State University. He is currently a professor of philosophy and associate director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values right here at The Ohio State University. He's done theoretical work in virtue ethics and made practical attempts to collapse the distance between education and action on the issue of extreme global poverty. He's also worked toward improving the quality of religious discourse, both among those who have faith and those who do not. We're also joined tonight by Dr. Carrie Brado. Dr. Brado received her PhD in Human Development and Family Sciences from the University of Texas at Austin. Sorry, I should say the University of Texas at Austin. That is my alma mater. Right, it's my alma mater, so I've got to give it due recognition. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and the director of Women's and Gender Studies at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. So she's from that state up north, but we'll not hold that against her tonight, since this is a discussion on love after all. Stemming from her interdisciplinary training, her research lies at the intersection of social cognition and the development of romantic relationships. She's particularly interested in how unmarried individuals' criteria for a partner interact with other factors in the mate selection process. Additionally, Dr. Brado researches both gender and cross-cultural differences in how people show love in romantic relationships. She's actively engaged in speaking and writing about the intersection of relationship science and Christianity, including how the two can be more fruitfully integrated. Dr. Praveen Sethupathy will be our representative from biology tonight. Dr. Sethupathy is an associate professor in the Department of Biomedical Sciences at Cornell University, where he directs a research laboratory focused on genomics, gene regulation, and human diseases. After receiving his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, he continued his training as a postdoctoral fellow with Dr. Francis Collins at the National Institutes of Health. He's published over 75 peer-reviewed articles in a wide array of scientific journals, and he's committed to engaging the public on science advocacy, as well as on topics related to science and faith. Dr. Sethupathy has been an invited speaker for the Veritas Forum, is a member of the BioLogos Voices program, and serves on the board of directors for BioLogos. And our final speaker tonight is Dr. Lisa Sung. Dr. Sung received her PhD in theology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. She's a systematic theologian rooted in the Reformed tradition. She was recently appointed to the Chester and Margaret Pollock Chair of Theology at Mundelein Seminary of the University of St. Mary of the Lake. Her appointment is aimed at helping the seminary community, which is a Catholic seminary, engage with the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. Prior to this appointment, she taught for 9 years at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, and is an invited member of the International Catholic Evangelical Conversation, which has received praise among other people from Pope Francis. Dr. Sung's research interests include theological interpretation of Scripture, the theology-social science relation, and the doctrine of sanctification. Her current major project is a volume on theological anthropology for the scholarly series Foundations of Evangelical Theology. Another book in progress analyzes, critiques, and reconstructs racial identity in light of Scripture and sociology. And now, without further ado, I'll hand things over to our moderator, Dr. Brown, to kick off the discussion. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
So it's not really my job to talk a whole lot. It's my job to moderate and make sure that the environment is as it should be. So I'd actually like to start out by acknowledging the absence of an elephant in the room and say, this is actually quite a lovely sized crowd, but this room is too big for it. So can we just move? Nobody in the back, people move up front. This is a ridiculous amount of emptiness, and it's not going to help us. So I'm serious. Move.
Are you feeling the love right now?
Yeah. So much better.
Nice.
Right? If this was in your house, you'd be like, whoa, what a party. Oh, it's a million times better already. Thank you for embracing social awkwardness. All right. So we've already had lovely introductions of all of our speakers. I'm not going to duplicate that at all. What I am going to do is just ask a few questions myself, and we will have a certain amount of discussion up here, leaving hopefully about the last half an hour or so for you guys to ask your own questions. So keep track of things you want to ask along the way. You'll have a chance. We're going to start out by asking just the question, what is love? And since each of you have your own unique research perspective, how is that research informing your concept of love? So each of them is going to have about 10 minutes to kind of explain how their own expertise fits into this. We're going to start with you, Praveen.
Sure. So let me first just thank all of the various sponsors of this event for inviting me to participate in this. All day we've been getting to know one another. And several of you, which has been a whole lot of fun. I think I can say that on behalf of all of us, so thank you. So, I think part of this 10 minutes is also a little bit of an introduction to each of us, not so much the professional side, which has already been covered. So what I thought I would do is give you kind of 6 bullet points to start with, that something about me, insight into me, through the lens of love, okay? And there's a broader point, so it's not just me sitting here sort of talking about myself. But, okay, so, I did my PhD in the city of brotherly love, right, Philadelphia. I fell in love with my wife when I was 17, so we're high school sweethearts. This is where you all clap. The best moments, the absolute best moments in my life were the birth of my 3 children, whom I dearly love, as you might suspect. I have closely followed and passionately love the Buffalo Bills since the age of 8. If you can believe it, I used to write poetry about them and have them published in the Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester, where I grew up, Rochester, New York. I have an abiding belief that is deeply rooted in my Christian faith that God is love. And one of my personal heroes is Corrie ten Boom, whom I'm not sure how many of you will know, but she and her family sacrificially saved hundreds of Jews during the horror of the Holocaust. And it is because she has said of her desire to love and represent God's love. Right? So a little bit of insight into me through the lens of love, as I said. But hopefully what you picked up on there is that each use of the word love is very different. Right? Love is this idea or this concept that we're all ultra familiar with. It's maybe a word that is even overused in our culture, and yet here we are talking about what it is, right? Which is, that in and of itself is a very fascinating sort of statement on our society. If you can believe it, genetics actually touches each of the different kinds of love that I just brought up in talking about who I am. And I don't have time to get into each of them, so I'm just going to highlight two that I thought might be particularly interesting in these introductory remarks. One is romantic love, and the other one is the sort of love for the other that sort of is going to come back to Corrie ten Boom a little bit. Okay. So romantic love, this is a little bit of a more lighthearted one, but I do want to convey the relevance of genetics in this context because rightly so, we think of romantic love in a little bit of a sort of whimsical and magical sort of way, right? And nothing that I say now do I want to draw away from that, right? Okay. But I do want to convey that just like any other really complicated social interaction or biological trait, there are some genetic underpinnings to romantic love, right? So there's this really neat study in fruit flies that was done about 10 years ago, and this probably wouldn't call it romantic love, but sexual attraction, mating preferences, okay? And so a female fruit fly was presented with a series of male choices, okay? It turned out that the female could sense, and we don't know exactly what it is, and I don't want to get into the pheromone debate. So we don't know if it's really a smell or sight or touch, and so that's still controversial. But the female could readily sense which males were more genetically compatible. And genetic compatibility is the concept that we're all familiar with, that we try to avoid inbreeding, right? That it's healthier for our offspring to mate with individuals who are genetically dissimilar to ourselves, right? The fruit fly, the female fruit fly could sense the genetically compatible males, and they would avoid the fruit flies that were more genetically similar to the female, right? Fruit flies don't know how to sequence DNA, right? So how do they know that? We don't know exactly, and there's a lot of research actually being done in this, okay? But we do believe that it has something to do with the complete set of chemicals and proteins that your body produces, maybe some of them emitted in the form of pheromones, okay? That elicit a certain response that she is what's called genetically primed to respond to, okay? And so for a while, people thought, well, that's just some weird fruit fly thing, right? But there's now some really interesting research that's emerging that suggests that mice have something similar that might be going on. In fact, so much so that one particular protein found in the urine of mice, okay, this is really taking away from the magic of romantic love, is so powerful in sexual attraction and mating preferences that it has been given the name Darcin, after Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, right? The male heartthrob, okay? And it does appear there's emerging evidence that suggests that different strains of mice produce slightly different kinds of Darcin that female mice are able to pick up on, right? And again, this sort of alluding to this genetic compatibility issue, right? Now, this kind of research has been a lot more complicated in humans, right? And so there's not very much definitive like that I can point to in the human context, but it does suggest the possibility of some kind of genetic underpinning to the preferences that we might have, right, in the kind of social interaction realm. Right? Now, the first thing that I and these geneticists involved in these studies would say is that that does not mean genetics predetermines anything here, right? It's not as though it sets you on your course and there's nothing that can change that, right? It's one among many, many factors, and obviously with humans there are a ton of factors that come into play in deciding who you're attracted to or who you're going to fall in love with, right? And certainly my wife is not going to be pleased with the notion that there's something connected to urinary proteins that is what caused us to be together, and nor am I suggesting that in any real way. But it is important to remember that, like most other interactions and traits, as I alluded to previously, there are possibly some genetic underpinnings as well, and it's a very active area of research. Okay? And I think it's really, really neat that it all serves to lead to genetic compatibility. Right? This idea of creating healthier offspring in order to perpetuate the species in a healthier way. The second and final thing that I will touch on is the love for other, as I mentioned. Right? So Corrie ten Boom, as I mentioned, was a remarkable, remarkable person because of the risks that she took to hide and help hundreds of Jews escape the Nazi occupation in Holland. But what's even more remarkable about her, she was eventually caught, imprisoned, put in a concentration camp. She survived the concentration camp. And after the war, she set up a rehabilitation center, first, primarily, to support Jewish people who had endured so much during that period of time, but also to provide support and rehabilitation for those who supported and actively participated in the Nazi horrors, directly against her and her family, and then many others whom she knew, and then, of course, the Jewish people she was trying to help. That is a remarkable kind of sacrificial forgiveness and laying down of oneself for someone. I mean, could you paint a picture of someone that could possibly be more against you, right? She was able to look deep into these people and feel that what united her with them was stronger than what divided her from them. Right? This is really powerful, and it came out of her Christian ethic that every person is made in the image of God. Every person is made in the image of God, and she worked hard to connect deeply with that person, look past the horrors of what they had done to see them as someone that had just as much capacity to reflect the love of God as she did. Right? And I think this is amazing to us because it's not a part of our natural experience. Usually, we're putting up walls, right? We're finding ways in which we can be different from some other people, right? We've got this group and that group and that group, and we're always stratifying and grouping, right? This is, I think, a shared experience for all of us, and some feel the brunt of it more than others in our society. But we're constantly engaged at this kind of thing, and so when you come across someone like Corrie ten Boom, it's life-changing, it's transformative, right? Because she's breaking down those walls and barriers. Okay, so what does genetics have anything to do with it? I think genetics, particularly genetic studies in the past 30 years, have done a tremendous job of breaking down the barriers that we have worked really hard to put up, but that are completely false and arbitrary, right? So this whole notion of race, for example, which tremendously troubles our society and our world, is a completely artificial construct and has no scientific basis, right? And I mean, sociologists have been actually saying this for some time, but the geneticists have been getting on board over the course of the last 30 years in particular with a lot of empirical data and studies to demonstrate that it's a very weak proxy for, ethnic differences, right? That race is completely based on our perception of things like skin color and hair type, right? Which are extremely poor ways of separating people genetically, right? So for example, you could identify one African in one tribe and another African in another tribe, and they would be more genetically dissimilar than one of those Africans and a European. Right? This has now become very, very commonplace knowledge among geneticists, but we're still working hard to communicate these things to the lay public in order to convey that, genetics is really helping, is very complementary with the, equalizing work of the gospel of Christ, right? That we are all kind of one, that there is no one that is better than another. Genetics is now coming behind to say, that's true, right? These differences are completely artificial and fabricated, right? And the sooner we embrace that, right, the easier of a time maybe we'll begin to have doing what Corey ten Boom does.
Excellent. We're going to switch to our psychologist. Carrie, go.
All right. So I don't have the 6 points about me, so you'll have to skip that part. Although I felt compelled, so I also met my husband at 17. We were high school sweethearts. So I
Nice.
if he gets a
Gotta
round
get
of
a clap
applause.
for that.
I have to do.
Me too. It wasn't high school, but I was still 17.
So as someone who would identify as a Christian relationship scientist, and I just kind of made up that title. I don't think anyone else maybe someone else calls themselves that, right? But I think I view love in a fairly multifaceted way. In a lot of ways, the parallels between kind of love and what I do in my research is probably even more direct for me than a couple of our other panelists, right? Because I'm researching people's romantic relationships. And when we think about romantic relationships, we think about love. And what's interesting, so even though I am looking largely, right, a lot of my research, I'm really interested in understanding how people choose their partners, right, and how our expectations, our cognitions, all these sort of things, right, interact with other things to lead to who we actually partner with, and then how that turns out down the road. And so part of what I look at is, people, if you ask them what they want in a partner, right, can give you a litany of the different traits and all the different things that they want. But something that it's taken relationship scientists a while to seem to acknowledge, right, is that when people are looking for a partner, they're not just looking for an amalgamation of traits, right? And what they're looking for is somebody who hopefully has these characteristics, right, but someone who they love. In fact, when you look at various studies that have kind of posed a question for people saying, if you could find someone who had every single trait, right, that you want in a partner, right, everything you ever wanted, but you didn't love them, would you marry them, right? And the vast, vast majority, right, of people, at least when we're kind of looking at Western cultures, it hasn't really been tested as much in other cultures, say no, right? They could have everything I want, but if they don't have love, and for me, who's trying to predict people's relationship choices, right, this is very difficult because this is throwing some thorns in my model in terms of, all right, so here's how these things work together. But then ultimately there's this X factor of love, right, that seems to be in a lot of ways the kind of ultimate deal breaker, right? It's the thing that we insist on to get into a relationship. It's the thing that many people talk about as having lost when they break up a relationship. And yet, so it has this kind of overarching importance to everything I do, and yet most psychologists do not like the term love. In general, right, love in psychology, particularly in social psychology, we kind of have a ambivalent relationship with it, right? Because in a lot of ways it's so broad that you don't know what you're assessing. Right? So part of what makes, some of the complications in a field like psychology, right, where we're looking at these more psychological constructs, right, particularly in relationship science, right, the things we're interested in aren't necessarily cells, right? We want to know love, all these other things, right? And so operationalizing these variables, right, is a really big part of what we do. And as it turns out, love is particularly difficult to operationalize because if you were to just ask somebody, right, tell me how much you love this person, that could mean so many different things that to just ask them that question, what do we even do with that data, right? What does that indicate? And so this ties into an even broader question of, so what is love, right? Is love an emotion? Is love a feeling? Is love a motivational drive, right? Is love a neurobiological addiction? Is love a cognition? Is love a kind of purposeful behavior, right? I mean, so on all of these things, you could probably say yes, right? And so, right, coming in as someone who then wants to capture love, right, and figure out what it's doing with all these other factors leads to a lot of complication. And so in that sense, a lot of times people in the field have just kind of regarded love in general as kind of an ill-defined term, right, that really is just confounded with so many other individual outcomes that we should just look at the outcome variables, right? So we should look at passion, intimacy. We should look at trust. We should look at these other things. And so as surprising it may seem, in the actual empirical work, relatively little of it is looking at love. It's looking at things that we would say are correlates of love, right? But that no one, researchers included, would argue constitute love in its entirety. And this, I think, there's a lot of different approaches that psychologists have taken to understanding love. There's not a fantastic consensus in general as to what exactly, where did love come from, right? So you've got people that will take an evolutionary approach, right? And this idea that love is essentially an evolved mechanism for pair bonding, right? Because to the extent that couples are drawn together to stay with each other for a while, right? This is going to aid reproduction in terms of raising children up to the age, right, where now their brains are big enough that they can sort of function, right, without quite as much intensive caregiving, which would have been reproductively advantageous. You've got attachment theorists, right, who are arguing that essentially what love is it's an extension of the attachment bonds that we form with our parents as infants, right, that then essentially get transferred to romantic partners later in life to provide a new form of felt security. You can take an interdependence or exchange theorist, right, who would say that, well, maybe love is just a particularly favorable social exchange, right, that, gives us particularly positive feelings. And so you've got all these different kind of conceptualizations, which not surprisingly then has actually led into a whole bunch of different just theories of, well, how do we break love down? Probably one of the more influential ones in terms of, even going outside of, tiny little academic bubbles where we read these things, is so Robert Sternberg has what some people call kind of the triarchic theory of love. And it's one of the more popular psychological theories. Basically what he proposes is that love has three components, right? So you've got intimacy, which he would say is an emotional component, right? And is really referring to that kind of attachment bond, to that feeling of safety with another person, to the sharing, mutual support, all of that. Second component, he would say, is passion, and he would call that your motivational component to love, with the idea of being, in the context of a romantic relationship, right, the kind of sexual passion that people experience. But he actually had it even broader than that, right? He didn't believe that his theory just applied to romantic relationships. He said you can have a passion to be a parent, right, and a passion for various other things in life that can form a component in your relationship. And then he had basically the third component is the decision and commitment, right? And so that's your cognitive component, and that is the intention, right, to continue to stay. So that's going to be more of your kind of purposeful behavioral and cognitive actions, right, that cause you to behave a certain way in a relationship. And so essentially, if you read his writings, right, he puts them in triangles, so he has lots of triangles, right? All these different possible triangles you can get, right? And a lot of it's, his idea is that if you have all three of these together in a decent kind of balance, right? This is what he calls consummate love. And had this idea that this in some ways is kind of, the love that a lot of people are looking for, right? We often look for it in romantic relationships, but he would argue that we can have this kind of consummate love in other relationships as well. And then essentially, depending on which components of the three are present and what balance they are in relation to each other, you can break it down into all these different types of love, right? So if I had intimacy and I had commitment, but I didn't have passion, he'd call it companionate love, right? And it all breaks down. But one thing I really think that I like about his theory, and one reason that it resonates with me, is that in addition to breaking up these components, right, he actually goes into a decent amount of detail about how it's not just the sum of its parts, right? So I think as psychologists, we're very prone to be like, okay, how can we break this down, right? So that I can give you something and figure out how much love you have, right? I want to capture that somehow. But he really went to great length to say, here's kind of our attempt at measuring this, right? But really what we see as part of what makes love full is the interaction between these components, right? It's how these components interact with the outside environment and all these other things. And so in addition to, I feel like this is a useful theory just in my own conceptualization, right? One, because it does encompass a lot of different types of love. And I think we use love in so many different ways, right? That if we want to try to understand it psychologically, we're going to have to start breaking it down a little bit more. Yeah. So I think it's useful empirically, it's useful practically in that sense. But the other thing I like about it is that I think it fits in a certain way with my own theological kind of interpretations of love. And that's, so one of the, descriptions of God in the Bible, and you kind of mentioned it, Praveen, is, God is love, right? And so I find that a very powerful image, right? And in the context of what I study, right? So we're kind of trying to capture what is love. Well, God is love. And I think in some ways, right, I see the parallels to, so God is infinite, right? God is multifaceted, right? God is love. But taking these different facets of God, as much as we try to understand him, right, putting those together, those components aren't God, right? There are images, there are snapshots of God, what we can understand. And I think if God is love, then it probably means that our attempts to operationalize love completely are about as fruitful, right, as our attempts to operationalize God completely. And so that has been an influential thing, right, and not saying that it's not valid to try to do this, right? We found a lot of really fascinating information through these studies, right, that I think can make a big influence in helping people build better relationships. But it also kind of lets me off the hook a little bit, right, in terms of this, obtaining exactly what love is psychologically probably is not something, right, that can actually be done.
Have you considered that the extra little bit that we can't quite operationalize is just the smell of each other's pee?
It could be that. Your MHC complex.
We're going to switch over to our theologian, Lisa.
I'm appreciating this already and finding many points of connection. So I'll just briefly define theology and the points that will frame the points that I'm going to bring up from the realm of theology. So theology, etymologically, obviously, logos means word or speech, and theos, God. So theology is fundamentally speech, discourse, reflection about God. And in particular, I would say it's reflection on scriptural teaching. It's thinking about what Scripture teaches and thinking with Scripture about the reality to which it attests. So on that basis, I would say that ontologically, from the biblical and Christian perspective, love is first and foremost one of the essential attributes of God. Love is ultimately a divine energy or power, which utterly uniquely, in the case of God, is perfectly actualized and fully operative from all eternity. So that actually, this relates to the point that you were making about how difficult it is to conceptualize, right, adequately what love is. Basically, the Christian tradition has always read Exodus 3:14 and 15, where God says to Moses, "I am who I am." The Christian tradition has understood that to be a statement that God is the only being, God is the perfect being, God is fully actualized in terms of all of God's attributes. And specifically, though, what's interesting is I thought about, okay, how does the Bible characterize God if God is love? 1 John 4:16. And what the Bible lays stress on is God's moral attributes. So again, what's utterly unique about God and distinguishes him from all the rest of finite contingent reality, which we are, is that all of God's attributes are eternally, fully realized, and they mutually co-inhere and are coextensive, to use a spatial metaphor. What this means is that all of the divine attributes or characteristics as we understand them, we are forced cognitively to think about each quality separately, but in God, they mutually co-inhere, they co-determine each other, they're compatible with each other, and they're inseparable. So that sounds really abstract. But if you look at Exodus 33, verses 12 and 13, when Moses boldly asks to see God's glory, God reframes the question altogether and says, I will cause all of my goodness to pass in front of you. All of my goodness. And then the way that God actually describes himself initially is, he says, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So the first thing that God says is characteristic, highlights about his goodness is his sovereignty and his absolute freedom to use his power and all of his capacities in any way that he chooses. And what's crucial is that God chooses to use all of his infinite power in a way that shows compassion and mercy for human beings. And then, relatedly, God emphasizes his holiness. No one may see me and live. So already we have a definition, a beginning definition of God's goodness. And in particular, what's highlighted is his disposition to have mercy and compassion on human beings and his holiness. But then, as you know, in Exodus 34, 6 through 7, when God actually passes by Moses, we have an even fuller recital, which fills in the picture even more in terms of what does God's goodness consist in. His personal name is Yahweh, and God says he is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving their wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generations. So all of this is highly significant because, again, we learn that God designates all of these qualities as constitutive of his goodness. His sovereignty and freedom of purpose of will and action, which he exercises. He elects to exercise them on behalf of human beings and of his creation, of their good, of their well-being. Compassion, mercy, holiness, graciousness, showing forbearance towards sinners, his justice, which is not apathetic toward wrong, but he condemns and rectifies wrongdoing. So my point is that what God perfectly personifies and is always self-consistently doing is consistent with all of these characteristics. Again, that's not easy for us. And what I think is relevant is that we human beings, we're prone to think of and treat love of all kinds, love for people, love for God, love for things, should treat love as an end in itself, as a good in itself that is unqualified. If I love something, it needs no justification, no qualification whatsoever. In other words, we often treat love in isolation from the other attributes of God, from what is true and right, what is good about God himself and about all things in relationship to him. So there's kind of an inbuilt, part of what is confusing or complicates things for us is we have these inbuilt sort of cognitive limitations, but then, of course, living post-fall as we do and sharing in the common human predicament of alienation from God and ambivalence, even as we're being restored in Christ, we still feel ambivalent about God, and his will. So I think that's one of the problems, and we're going to deal with that later. But so again, I think experientially we're prone to treat and pursue love as an ideal and as a good in and of itself, in isolation from God and the other qualities that define God's goodness. So we're often short-sighted. We're prone to trade in long-term goods in exchange for short-term gains and momentary satisfactions of our desires. The main point that I'm making here is that in order for our loves to be conducive to actual well-being and flourishing of human beings, love needs to be tested, it needs to be examined, it needs to be ordered and set aright. It needs to be coherent with the truth. It needs to be consistent with the truth, right? And with holiness and goodness and that sort of thing. So love and isolation, we can't help, thinking that way. And yet, from a biblical perspective, since God himself is love, and is goodness. Goodness is the larger, morally good. So God's moral excellence consists of all those attributes. And for us, being made in the image of God and in the image of Christ, particularly, who is the true image of God, when we think about love from a biblical perspective, theological perspective, we need to have a more holistic understanding of what is good for human beings, from that perspective. And so, secondly, then love is, if it's ultimately a divine attribute, it's obviously human loves. Love and loves have their ultimate origin and ultimate goal and consummation in God. So the human capacity, the desire, the impulse, the drive to seek love, to give and receive love is implanted in us by God himself. So God is love, and love comes from John, both affirmations from First John. The third point that I want to make, which lines up with what observations made already earlier, is that we need to speak about love in the plural. Not only is there God's love, but there are many human loves, and that's legitimate, obviously, because God himself created the cosmos with incredible, biodiversity. We read about that in Genesis 1 and that sort of thing. So everything that God created is good and is legitimately to be valued and loved. Okay, briefly, I just want to set a couple of categories out on the table, which are very helpful. I think they're from C.S. Lewis. He classifies three main forms of what he calls natural human loves or natural affections. The first one he calls affection, and it's based fundamentally on the attachment, and particularly to parents. But he uses it metaphorically to refer to all things that we become familiar with. We potentially develop a bond of what he calls affection, just because they're familiar. So even people or things or places that we might not otherwise be drawn to, if there's enough time, we might develop nostalgia and love in that sense. But there's nothing intrinsically necessarily good about that. The second category is the category of friendship, and he points out friendship is the least biological of all loves. It actually, you might differ, but he would say that it fulfills no necessary biological or survival function, at least the way that Aristotle and others understood it. Friendship in the bond is actually a shared perspective or outlook on something, shared view, shared value in some activity. The third category of natural loves is eros, which he defines as the state of being in love. I'll just point out for now that Plato's concept of eros didn't just have to do with romantic love or sexual attraction, that sort of thing, but Plato thought that eros recognizes the beauty in some object or person, and it's that beauty that attracts us and calls forth or evokes, our love. So eros, though, is intrinsically it's a matter of it's a desire for possession because of the beauty in the object. It's a desire for personal possession and personal fulfillment. So eros has been understood to be essentially egocentric. It's about fulfilling some void in myself, through that. And then lastly, and this is what's most distinctive about the Christian viewpoint, there is divine love, which gets translated as agape in the New Testament. And so what's interesting in particular about this is that, as C.S. Lewis puts it really well, he says, the natural human loves are not sufficient. They're not sufficient to sustain any relationship, any of the natural loves for family, friends, for even romantic partners or whatever. And he says they're not able, those relationships won't run on themselves or won't be nourished, because he points out there's something naturally unlovable in each one of us. He says you might as well ask people to love the taste of rotten cheese or the sound of a mechanical drill, especially if it's a dentist drill that's near in your mouth and that sort of thing. So he says the thing about that distinguishes divine love, agapic love, which is described in 1 Corinthians 13, etc., is that fundamentally it is love for the unlovely. It is what enables us to love and show forbearance for and forgiveness for the unlovely. When there isn't a natural bond, there isn't any natural quality in the object or in the person that would otherwise attract us. And so my last and final point for now is simply that if we want to know what the perfection is of all the natural human loves as well as divine love, we need to look to Jesus Christ, who shows us. We see that in the Gospels, but then in particularly in the way that he responded to his tormentors and torturers and executioners. In particular, he embodies all the qualities not only of 1 Corinthians 13, but of Romans 12 as well. And so I will just say, maybe just to throw that out there, this is a definition from the philosopher Dallas Willard, which I find extremely helpful in isolating, putting the finger on what is agapic love, divine love, that makes it different from human loves. He says, Willard says, agapic love is distinguished from desire, and it's located in the will, leaving room for desire and feeling to play an appropriate role in love without making them the heart of the matter. Agapic love is not action, not even action with a special intention, but it's a source of action. And he says, agapic love is not desire and not delight. Desire and feelings generally have a different nature than agapic love. They fall into the domain of impulse, not that of choice. They aim at their satisfaction, not at what is better and possibly best. Choice considers alternatives and weighs what is best. If its vision is broad enough, it will find what is good and right. The larger holistic perspective, right? If it is surrendered to God, united with His will, it will be able to do what is best. That is the nature of agapic love. It seeks what is best. That is why it enables a person to refrain from hating their enemy, which they might very well want to do, and to seek what is good for them along with all others concerned. And maybe lastly, one other really helpful description that he gives is the agapic love of which Paul and Jesus spoke which characterizes Corrie ten Boom as well in her ability to forgive the German concentration camp guard who came over and shook his hand and said, it's so great that you're speaking and traveling and talking about the message of God's forgiveness. She said she was unable to meet his hand, but so she prayed, Lord, I can't do it, help me. And she found her hand rising and being able to extend her hand to him. So agapic love is something which involves the orientation of the whole self toward what is good and right, and something which has amazing supernatural power for good as it indwells the individual. So with that, I will move on.
All right, so we're going to have just a couple questions, and there's no particular structure here, but try to keep things brief so we can make it through these and still have time for other questions. So we've now seen three different perspectives on positively what is love, but now I want you to talk about what are some of the obstacles to loving, so what makes love hard, because love is not always or even usually easy, I don't know. Whoever.
Yeah, I think, I sort of alluded to one of these previously, right, and that is our natural tendency to put up barriers, and the very notion of love is one that extends across barriers, right? Love for the other is one that we've been talking about in particular here this evening. And so if you're in the business of putting barriers up, right, then it becomes really difficult, right, quite naturally to then extend across aisles and across barriers. And again, as I mentioned, genetics can be helpful here, but it's not a solution, right? Although in some instances it has been really powerful. There have been some white supremacists who have found out, right, through studies of their DNA, right, that they're actually closer to some African American brothers, right, than whoever they might prefer their ancestry to be, right, whether it's Scandinavian or Nordic of some kind or something like that. So genetics in that way has played a very powerful role. But I'd actually like to talk about something else, and that is, I think we've established in all three of our kind of introductory remarks that there are many different kinds of loves, right? We talked about natural loves and, agapic love, or, we specifically discussed romantic love and that kind of thing. One of the things I like to think about in considering what the obstacles there are to love is we better either define what love we're talking about, or we better identify some shared themes across all these loves. Right? And one that's really coming to my mind quite strongly this evening is that there is a cost associated with every single one of these loves. Right? Even my sort of silly little, I loved the Buffalo Bills. I as an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, we went through 4 losses in the Super Bowl, right? Buffalo Bills fans are no joke, right? We are tough because of it, right? But it was painful, right? So every kind of love, even sort of those kinds of maybe less deep attachments that we might have and that we might characterize as love colloquially, come with some kind of cost, right? Because we lose something. There's some pain or loss that is associated with each of these kinds of love.
Any other thoughts?
So one thing that, I kind of think, and it goes along with, you said, we'd have to distinguish what type of love we're talking about. And I think that might be important on more than one level, right? Because when I'm thinking in the context particularly of romantic relationships, I think some of the problems we run into is that we expect our partner to be all of these kind of loves, right? So we know that love manifests itself in a lot of different ways, right? But what we see, and this is actually an increasing trend, that we are essentially expecting more and more in terms of what our romantic partner, right, particularly when we're looking at kind of like a life partner, right, our spouse, should be fulfilling. And so it's fascinating, right, because I think people, if you want to look at the church and everything, have for some time, right, said, don't look to, people, to your spouse or whatever, to fill, right, what only God can fill. What's interesting is I think, people coming at it from a completely secular perspective in relationship science are finding exactly the same thing, right? Not necessarily saying to look to God, but in the idea that as we ask for more and more, right, and they actually, somebody really fascinating piece called The Suffocation of Marriage, and the idea being that essentially as our basic needs have been met more readily, right, we've looked less to marriage at meeting those basic needs, and we're kind of going up. So if you're familiar with like Maslow's, hierarchy, right? We're moving up the thing, such that now most people, right, what we view as a good relationship, what we view as love, is we want a partner who can help us reach self-actualization, right? Which you laugh, but we do, right? If you ask people, right, I want someone who's my support, right, who's my lover, who is always there for me, who will sacrifice for me, who's my long-term companion, right, who helps me, we can raise a family together. We want them to do a lot of things. And not all of those things are bad. A lot of those are very good things, right? But the difficulty of trying to get all of that in one person, right, almost sets us up for unattainable sort of relationship expectations. And so I think that sometimes not distinguishing that, hey, this can look at different ways. Love can be more broad, right, than just my romantic relationship and needs to be in my life, right? That is an important thing to actually making these various relationships flourish.
Good. And what you both have shared remind me of a couple of other insights that C.S. Lewis, again, put so incredibly well. One of the things that he said in conjunction with the observation that the natural human loves are not capable of sustaining loving relationships long-term by themselves. They need divine charity or agapic love. We need the love of God, when we injure, offend, disappoint, let down, fail one another, that sort of thing. I would say that what comes to mind for me, one of the things that makes love so difficult, even with people with whom I have intimacy, and commitment, and those other, whatever the third triarchic characteristic is actually put so well in Luke 6:27 through 36, which is actually a really helpful passage that gets at the heart of what distinguishes agapic love, divine love, from human love. And so I'll just put, if it's okay, I'll just read this. This is in the Lucan version of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, agapically love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other. Also, if someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks from you, and if anyone takes whatever belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you." And then here is the really shrewd observation about human nature that I think makes it so difficult for us. "If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But you love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Heavenly Father is merciful." So the kind of love that Jesus calls His followers to, we're not naturally capable of. And one thing that I've been very much pondering, reflecting on in my personal life is how much he says it's all, human loves are mostly depend on reciprocity, the principle of reciprocity. If I do good to you, I expect some kind of recognition or appreciation or payback, right? And that's, again, I know that some theories of, biological theories of altruism and all the rest, have to do with that. But most of human relationships actually runs on the fuel of reciprocity. And we get angry, when it's not reciprocated, that kind of thing. And that's part of what makes love so difficult, even in the context of, closest, our closest and most intimate relationships and that sort of thing. Which is why we need to be indwelled by, we need an infusion from, a continual infusion of God's unconditional love and forgiveness, which enables us to not be confined to and trapped in, the anger, the disappointment, etc. When people, don't extend to us or don't offer us that which we think we're entitled to on a strictly retributive payback, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours sort of a basis. So that's what distinguishes them, I would say.
Good. So I want to, I gave them all the questions ahead of time. And that's too easy, so I'm going to switch this one up a little bit. So how is love, the question that I gave you is, how is love different? How is love for outsiders different from love for loved ones? But we've already, I guess I kind of expected at this point in the conversation to have focused more on loved ones, friends, family, etc. And there's actually been quite a lot of discussion of the other already. So this is the little twist on it that I want to ponder. So sometimes I wonder if it's actually, either if it's good to have loved ones, or why it's good to have loved ones, right? So if it turns out, genetically speaking, we're all pretty much the same and every individual is basically equally valuable, then why are we having these special sorts of close, intimate relationships with lovers, with family? Like, why isn't it just babies all go into the baby farm and we all go off to work and we all just serve each other as a society? So with that kind of thing in mind, as well as just the general idea, what exactly is the difference between how we're supposed to be loving other folk that don't have these special relationships, and how are we supposed to love the folk that do, and why are those things good? Does that make any sense? You're making lots of faces.
It made sense until just the very end.
The how part was a little confusing.
Same thing, just go. Just do it. Whatever you thought the good question was, answer that.
it?
I think it's,
Whichever one you
why
want.
is it that
Why?
why is it that we want to love?
Why we
this way?
have
why
loved
is it
ones.
good
Why is love
to even
good?
do this?
I get
The
to
other
start.
kinds of love. So, it seems like we can say agapic love, that's grand. Let's just do all that all the time.
Yeah, the natural loves, you mean?
The other ones are not as obviously good.
Sorry,
okay.
no, please,
No, go
please. You sure?
Go for it.
Okay. Because I think that they result in the greatest joy. They cause the greatest pain and incur the greatest cost, as I was alluding to before, but they create the greatest joy, right? The things I put on my list were I came up with them in 5 seconds, because those are the things that I'm most passionate about, that give me the greatest joy, that as I look back in my life, I think about with tremendous fondness, right? And so, I think we are highly, highly relational beings that want to be together in these kinds of intimate relationships because they do bring us the greatest joy. I think from a theological perspective, I think it's also because, God is relational, right? And if we are image bearers of God, then we're going to be relational, right? And so in a way, it's sort of just reflecting who he is, wanting to be in communion all the time with his creation and with himself, and but I think part of that is because it's what brings the most tremendous, lovely, beautiful joy in life.
That wasn't going to say exactly the same way, right? But in a lot of ways, we as humans have a desire to be in relationship, right? And this can take different forms, right? But people who cannot form these kind of bonds, right? We can tell that's not natural, right? These are not people who are thriving when they can't form relation with other people. And I think, as Praveen pointed out, a lot of the images of God in the Bible are relational, right? Talking about, God as a father, right? Talking about, even, the bride and his groom, and all, there's a lot of the bridegroom and his bride. And I think a lot of that imagery, right, gets at an underlying human reality, right? In psychology, they say, the basic drive to belong, right? And I think that although there's a lot of good, right, in sacrificing for the, other and everything like that, and that is a very good type, right? But it doesn't provide the same sort of community, right, that humans seem to need at a basic level. So that's kind of, I think it's would be considered a psychological need to have these things.
That's good.
And I would just add, in very much in conjunction with what they both said, that to be a person is to be particular. And so God loves people in all their uniqueness and particularity. Obviously, it's obvious no two people are alike, and so to recognize the dignity of personhood and of unique personhood, we need to actually pay attention to the person in front of us, and particularly the person that God puts into our lives and that sort of thing, particularly to care for. And that's in some ways, that's the only way that their particular uniqueness and beauty and capacities, all of that emerge. And so infants in World War II who were not picked up and cuddled, right, failed to thrive and died and that sort of thing. And that's true not only for infants, but all along the lifespan as well, So God has, created us to be vehicles of his and means of his grace and blessing and flourishing to one another. And the flip side of that, sadly, is that we can so deeply damage one another as well, through inattention and neglect and everything else, across the gamut. But somehow the particularity and the preciousness of persons and each unique person requires that kind of care and attentiveness, and cultivation and tending over time.
That's great. Great. So we're going to start fielding questions from the audience. I've already got a few, so either some of you are really good at memorizing phone numbers or the organizers are sending me questions. There's a way to get the phone number up here, though, right?
Yep, I'm on right now.
While he does that, I'll just ask this first question, but they'll start showing up here, and I'll pick my favorite ones. So this is a question for Praveen, our geneticist friend, which is a question that I had sort of had in mind also when you were talking. So if we have this genetic disposition to pick, to sort of select for diversity, that does seem to be in conflict with some other things that we know, like our genetic predisposition to be kind of racist. So if someone looks a lot different than us, there's a certain amount of, it looks like, I mean, as far as I understand it, there's evidence that we seem to kind of want to shun them because they look too different.
Yeah.
So if that seems in tension, right? Because if I really want more diversity, I should be looking for the weirdos.
That's right. It's absolutely in tension. And so keep in mind, right, that any kind of genetic underpinnings there might be in mate selection is one among a trillion of factors, right? And so by no stretch of the imagination is it deterministic, right? Or does it even have some sort of outsized influence? I would say that it plays a role, but clearly we grow up in the context of a society that then places all sorts of other prejudices and predispositions and ways of thinking into our minds that could very easily, and it's apparent to us, right, overwhelm and overcome those, as geneticists would call, priming events in us biologically, right? So we're primed maybe to think certain ways, but then we can be conditioned quite easily to think in all sorts of other ways that are contrary to our priming. There's no doubt about that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, the more, so you're talking about fruit flies, right, and mice, and the higher order species, right, that you get the genetic effects tend to be less direct, right, because you're always going to have those epigenetic, right, the environment is going to play a larger role in determining any particular outcome.
This is true, right, and so the more variables there are, right, the less that any one particular variable contributes to the overall outcome, right, is a way of sort of thinking about it. And so this is one of the many reasons why it has been harder to kind of pinpoint these kinds of examples in humans. But I think the growing number of examples with, genetic contributions in many other species suggests that there's probably some kind of role like that in us too. But very clearly, it's just one among many, many other kinds of factors.
And one that we might not necessarily be cognitively aware of or conscious of, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's part of the being a more complex and higher order being as persons. We have obviously, we have thought, belief, sensation. We have volition. So we're moral agents. All of these other things, desire and intentionality. So all of these. All of these, they're additional variables, certainly, and complexify, our decisions.
So this one, you did exactly what you're supposed to do as far as all of you sort of answering questions that might be focused on a particular person. This one is focused particularly on Carrie. So what is the... wait, sorry, that's the wrong thing. No, that's right. Basically, what kind of things have you discovered in your research that you find enlightening or counterintuitive or interesting? Like, what are the surprising, cool things that that stand out?
That's broad, but
the good stuff.
I mean, so like I said, a lot of my research, more specifically in terms of the kind of research that I'm conducting as opposed to just reading, right, is really looking a lot at those kind of mate selection choices that we make, right? And I'm very interested in looking at how our cognitions, right, what we say we want, our criteria, reflect or don't reflect our later behaviors, right? And so one thing that has been just really interesting in general is that, although this might just seem like you could have guessed this anyways, right? But oftentimes what we say we want is not what we do, right? So we have all these things over here, right? But they do not necessarily guide our behaviors in a straightforward manner. And so that can then, of course, lead to some complications in terms of, so if someone is making a poor choice of partners, right, which sometimes people do, and it's not their criteria that are driving that poor choice, right? Then it becomes this more complex sort of question of, well, what is actually driving that? And so some of the stuff that I found most interesting is actually looking into implicit preferences for a partner. And so I have been really working on developing ways of essentially looking at the more subconscious, the automatic sort of reactions, right, that are not in our conscious awareness in terms of this is what's drawing me to a particular type of person, but may nonetheless be developed from our early working models, right, of what we see in our families growing up, right, what we see in kind of those early experiences even with our parents, that therefore might be guiding our behavior in relationships more so that then we realize, even if those things don't match up with what we say explicitly, this is what I want. And there's been some interesting things that I've been finding in that respect in terms of just how much our implicit behaviors, our implicit attitudes might be driving a lot of these things. And what the potential implications of that is for just kind of long-term relationship outcomes.
All right, good. So this one's focused a bit on Lisa. So all of this has been kind of Christian-y talk. Not everybody out there is kind of Christian-y. So here's from a person who, as an atheist, sort of wants to know, why should we expect that mining a text like the Bible is going to give us any particularly helpful insight? Why should we think this reflects reality? Now, obviously, that's a really big question. So I guess maybe to focus it a bit more personally, like, what is it? Maybe ask it this way: what is it about that book that has led you to continue going back to it as a source of insight, as opposed to any number of other things you might go to as a source of insight?
Wow, that's a great question. I'll speak a bit autobiographically here and say I didn't grow up in the Christian tradition. I actually became a Christian as a graduate student. And so actually for me it actually was the discovery of the Bible and reading the Bible and discovering that its diagnosis of the human condition, both our what is innately good about us and our deepest desires, as well as what accounts for the fact that despite the fact that I in many ways, in many cases, I know what is good and conducive toward health and long-term well-being, I still seem to engage in these sort of self-sabotaging kinds of choices and behaviors, that sort of thing. And so here we're getting at the mystery of human beings and the human condition. So, okay, I'm going to cite Saint Augustine, who was a 5th century philosopher who converted to Christ well into adulthood and that sort of thing. His Confessions is actually sort of an epochal kind of a work. He says basically about God, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." That was the result of many, many years of searching, and he was one of the best educated philosophical minds in the Roman Empire. He also said, in conjunction with that, he said, "Apart from you," meaning God, "what am I but a guide to my own destruction?" as well. He realized that he actually had this theory of desire, and that we are creatures of desire. Fundamentally, we're guided by our desire for love even more than we're creatures of intellect and that sort of thing. But he came to realize through a very long and circuitous path of really partaking of all the delights that life had to offer, that sort of thing. He found that this insatiable craving for love and for meaning was only satisfied as he came to recognize and surrender and entrust himself to God, who is good. So there are many reasons. I would say that I personally find the Bible's diagnosis of its description of the world in all of its beauty and glory and mystery, and yet also the mystery of the loss of the good, and also of the strange power that we find afflicts us, afflicts our will. We desire the good, but we find ourselves incapable of doing it for some reason. I personally find the Bible's account of it. It's for me, the most accurate and the most compelling description, empirically, as well as the solution that it points us to. The way out of our predicament is embodied in a historical person, in the person of Jesus, who, as the heart of the Bible story is that God's redemptive self-gift in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, it actually restores, it reorders the cosmos. It is the solution to this, if I can put it this way, the dark force, which strangely and mysteriously is embedded within us, as well as in the external world in various ways. And so ultimately, what the Bible proclaims is that God ultimately came and became one of us, took on a human nature, and Jesus of Nazareth lived the life that we were designed to live. He lived a perfectly good and loving life in loving God with the totality of his being, and always loving, doing good, being faithful in his love and treatment of others. So he lived that life that we were designed to live, but we find ourselves incapable of living out due to some inner brokenness, some disconnect, some sort of aversion, as well as attraction that we have to God. And
you guys want to jump on this too?
Yeah. So basically, I'll just say that Jesus went to the cross. He bore our sins on our behalf, and because of his righteousness, because of his faithful love, he was raised to life and now is able to offer the love and the freedom to do the good that we were designed to be able to do, and that our hearts long for.
Yeah, I resonate a lot with what you said, Lisa, and I think something that's worth reaffirming is this notion that, at least in my life, I agree with everything Lisa said about the diagnosis that the Bible provides and all of that, and resonating strongly with that as I look around the world. But really, for me, it was more the person and the character of Christ is what drew me in. I'm familiar with a lot of other faith traditions that have a lot of interesting things to say about the world and why it is the way that it is, and I think there's a fair bit to be learned from those traditions as well. But what's tremendously unique and captured my attention, and that I couldn't understand for a long time and still sometimes have my difficulty wrapping my head around, is the person of Christ. And what's very relevant in saying that in today's conversation about love is because love and power are these kind of words that sometimes are kind of contradictory, and yet he embodied them. He embodied them perfectly, both at the same time. This was what was so jarringly unusual to me, right? I'd never really come across a character like this, right? When the superheroes that I knew about from all sorts of other faith traditions, right, exemplified power, it was not necessarily, certainly not always, with love, right? But with him, they were never decoupled, right? To him, he completely disabused me of my notions of power. It was not sort of exerting my perceived superiority on others. It was laying myself down for the sake of others, right? It was just sort of complete 180 from everything that I'd ever seen that I might imagine making up a story about. And so it compelled me to come back. And I think that's a worthy point making on conversation on love.
Could I have this is a really great description, I think, of David Brooks, the commentator. He describes it the way Jesus actually shows us what power is for, how it's intended to be used, how God himself uses his own power. And so Jesus shows us what God does with power and what we're intended to do, which is to serve and to promote the well-being and the flourishing of others.
Yeah.
So he says to follow Jesus' model of love in the use of power is to enter every relationship from below and hoping to serve upwards.
Did you want to jump in on this one, or should we move on?
You can move on, that's fine.
Okay.
They covered it well.
So I like this. This is a nice practical kind of a question. I'm just going to read this one verbatim. It's hard being a single Christian, and I'm only getting older. Can you please comment on the decline of the importance of marriage in society and in Christian circles? So, I mean, one might wonder if you're studying kind of a dying dinosaur. I mean, we know that the divorce rate sort of spiked in the 20th century, and now it's going down. But the reason it's going down is because no one's getting married anymore. The marriage rate's going down to the floor. So, I mean, that's the like fake news version. So, give me the real scoop.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question in terms of, and something that you said, right, the idea that divorce is going down, but marriage is going down so much too. We do see a decrease in marriage rates, but a lot of it is just delaying marriage. What's interesting and what a lot of sociologists as well as psychologists have commented on is actually the surprise that marriage hasn't gone away faster, right? So once we've decoupled marriage from being the step that you had to take to be part of society, right? There is no ways outside of marriage to be a full adult historically. Once that was decoupled, right, the idea was, why should marriage exist anymore? And yet most people, right, not in all countries, but particularly still in the US, and this is true for religious as well as non-religious people, most people are interested in marriage or a marriage-like relationship, right? So they might not do it in a church, right? But the idea of making a commitment, right, to a person with the intention, at least of that time, right, of staying with them, is actually not a mentality that's going away as much as we think it is. It changes form, right? The package we put on it might look a little bit different, but I think it's actually still a pretty strong ideology, which is part of the reason, right, maybe sometimes too strong of an ideology, right, because then it's like, oh man, I'm getting up in years, right? And we do have, right, and I think Christian circles in particular can sometimes propagate, right, some of the pressures that people can feel in terms of, this is kind of part of this life step sequence that I need to go through, right? Finding a partner, although we've made it more flexible when that can happen, is still something most people expect to have fitting into their sequence. And not fitting into that sequence is still difficult to do in our society. And we could argue the merits and downsides, right, of that. But I would argue that it's not, probably for a variety of reasons, a dying dinosaur.
So then if the marriage age is moving back, that's good news for single old people.
Yes. I mean,
There's
people are
still
getting
hope.
married later.
Let's just do one more with the understanding that if you want to come chat after we officially let people go, that's an option. But I like to try to let people go as close to the stated end time as possible. So one more question. You know what, I'm just going to read this one verbatim too. Being a fan of the Buffalo Bills might be a good example of unconditional love, so kudos for that. What does the notion of unconditional add to the conversation about love? Is unconditional presupposed in the term love, or is that a quality of specifically agapic love? So what's up with the unconditional? This is for everyone.
Yes. Okay. Well, C.S. Lewis makes the point. He says, natural human loves never quite seek simply the good of the loved object for the object's own sake. They are biased in favor of those goods that they themselves can bestow or those which they would like best in themselves, or those who fit in with a preconceived picture of the life they want the object to lead. Again, natural gift love is always directed to objects which the lover finds in some way intrinsically valuable, lovable, objects to which affection or eros or a shared point of view, i.e. friendship, attracts him, or failing that, to the grateful and the deserving, or perhaps those whose helplessness is of a winning and appealing kind. But divine love, love himself working in a person, is wholly disinterested, is wholly selfless, and simply desires what is best for the beloved, even if that means that, even if I'm hoping, I would love to have a romantic relationship with this person, still, even if I can't be in the picture and in that role or whatever, I would still want the best for that person. That's what he says is characteristic of that. And he says divine gift love, agapic love, in a person enables them to love what is not naturally lovable. Lepers, criminals, enemies, morons, the sulky, the superior, and the sneering. There you have it.
Unconditionality.
So unconditionality, when I think about it in psychological terms, is difficult for me, right? Because I think sometimes when we think of unconditional love, right, within the context of close relationships, you can get into problems, right? I mean, there are some cases, and that's when we get into, well, what does it mean to love, right? What does that look like? What are we operationalizing that as, right? Because staying in a relationship unconditionally, right, isn't always a good choice. In fact, a lot of times, right, that's not the most loving for either person. And so I think, so sometimes I agree, right, with this idea of unconditional love, but I think we have to define what are we talking about with love, right? Because sometimes I think it's this idea of just sticking with somebody, right, no matter what. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that that is really what is meant by that, right? When things become unhealthy, dangerous sorts of situations.
Right. Which is where, briefly, just where, again, I think realizing that love is part of a complex of goods, and love ultimately aims at, divine love certainly aims at the maturity and the well-being and the flourishing of the person. So love, unconditional love, if it means enabling someone, is not actually loving them in the long term. It's not directed toward their long-term well-being and maturity and flourishing.
No, I think that's
Okay. Then let's officially call it quits. Thanks for coming out. Thanks to our panelists.